works. Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Extremely erudite and enlightened co-chairs who have already introduced the topic to you, my fellow panelists who are, again, experts in this field. And I also want to thank my co-author for this, Manas Tiwari, who's going to join shortly, and in my absence, he can come and take questions about this paper. What I want to do is talk about a little bit about what we did in the course of the past 2 years, working along with Government of India and CERC, the states, the industry, POSOCO, in evolving some common thoughts on what role markets play and how we take this forward. And in an environment where renewable energy is becoming the new reality, undeniable reality at scale, what is the role of markets in making that reality a better one? I mean, if I had to, before going into the slides, if I had to just look at, what role markets are playing, we are a federation. India is a federation, and what holds a very diverse federation together is the Constitution of India. It is more impactful than we normally think about it to be. Similarly, markets, in some sense, is the glue which holds the whole thing together, the various entities, various players, various interests, and the various geographies which are the states of the country. Those come together when we come to the markets. And this is a very important role which one needs to recognize as we go forward. That's an essential glue for holding the whole power system together, especially in a regime where we're going to see even more disparate forces. Particularly renewables coming in, various kinds of disruptive forces. And paradoxically, those forces might further the ambit of markets, which is something, as I said, is going to be a good thing. So as Mr. Narasimhan mentioned, this has been an effort supported by the Power Sector Reforms Program, which has been sponsored by DFID. And we went through a series of interactions which brought this together. In all these interactions, Secretary Power of Government of India participated, the Chairman of Renewable Energy of CERC participated in those. So you should take these as something which is a bit of a distilled view. It doesn't have to be the only view, but it's a distilled view from a range of experts who have pulled this together. And what we are going to cover in the next 15 minutes or so is talk about the energy transition, some of the critical challenges, but quickly go to the markets and the building blocks, and some views on what are the ways to go forward and take the implementation forward. Just as a context, we are seeing more and more investments in renewable energy. Now, if you look at that block on the left-hand side, what you see is that that block has become as large in terms of investments as the investments called in by fossil fuels. It wasn't the case like this earlier. Fossil fuel-based resources, be it oil and gas in particular, used to attract a lot more investments. But today, the power networks are attracting, or power sector is attracting a lot more investments, and progressively it will become more than fossil fuels. We are seeing a large-scale electrification of the global economy. Today, the contribution of electricity to primary energy consumption, the consumption level is about 18%. In a generation, we'll reach about 30%, and people are saying that it's going to be more than 30%. Now, that kind of a shift in a generation is a big, big shift. And that shift is being caused largely by renewables. That shift is being fueled largely by renewables. So what we are seeing is that the renewables and the network in combination is attracting most of the investments. Thermal power is already lower than renewables globally, as you can see. The prognosis for India is that in terms of coal-fired coal consumption in India, we're going to be roughly 3 times what we are currently are by 2040. This is a BP Energy World Energy Outlook projection. It is unlikely to be so in my assessment based on the current trends which I see. If you ask NTPC what it wants to be, today it doesn't want to be the largest generator. It wants to be the largest renewable generator. And if you look at banks, what are they going to finance? They are not going to finance new coal-fired power plants. They are going to finance renewable power plants. This is the reality, especially if it's in the private sector. So the new reality is that we are going to live with renewables. The question then comes is what the chairs raised, is that how do we manage those renewables? How do we thrive in the environment which is very, very renewable heavy, and what role markets can play in that. The famous duck curve, which we have seen, it's happened across the world. This was on the left-hand side is the California load curve, net load curve on FY17, so which is the orange line goes like a duck towards the evening peak, and the afternoon drops. On the right-hand side is what were prognosticated for, I can talk about the status, about Punjab for their plans which they had, what kind of challenges would they face, and the same duck curves comes up. Reality is that that duck curve is already here in 2019. If you look at the states of Rajasthan and you look at the states of Karnataka, they're actually contending with a huge amount of renewables even today, and you're seeing that curve play out. The good thing is that we are still managing the system. We are finding good ways of managing the system. It can become better once we have deeper markets. So with the renewables, assuming centrality in the power sector, what are the issues we are dealing with? There are essentially two broad issues which we are dealing with are variability and intermittency, right? These are the things which we have to sort out. But dealing with them is easier said than done. And we need markets, but we need a range of measures across the board, part of which will be through markets. So my proposition to all of you, as well as in other forums I have made, is that we have to accept renewables as the new baseload. It is a variable and intermittent baseload, but that is the baseload. And everything else has to play around that variable and intermittent baseload to balance that base. Think of that. We have not operated like that in the past. We have always had coal-fired plants as the baseload, and everything else fills the valleys. That's how we have operated. The implication of that is that our commercial arrangements, our contracts, our operating mechanisms, our scheduling, dispatch settlement processes, everything thinks of coal as the baseload. No longer the case. We have to change from that, and we have many tools and levers which we have to use, markets being one of them. So we have to look at a range of issues around power purchase and dispatch mechanism, because of our PPAs, which are designed for baseload PPAs, are no longer going to perform. At least most of them are not going to be baseload anymore. Some will be very close to the pit heads will be, but the rest of them will be intermittent. It'll be essentially balancing resources for that. Some of them might operate only seasonally. Rajasthan sees that, Karnataka sees that those power plants operate only seasonally when there's high agricultural demand. Other than that, they are boxed up at various times. Now, this is something which the states are learning to do. They are learning to play in that, and how they play through that is through markets. But before that, I think there is a step to recognize that the nature of contracts which we have need to change. Now, states can still do that because they own the generation, so they can play in a certain way without regard for what kind of contracts they have. Essentially, while we have generation and distribution separated, they think like the same entity still, and there's a certain amount of flexibility which it provides. But our IPP contracts are not like that. Our CGS GENCO contracts, central generating station contracts are not like that. So there is a need for rethinking that. We need fuel allocation mechanisms to change. Now, when I say fuel allocation mechanisms need to change, do we need to allocate in a hard and fast rule like we have done? When the whole world is changing, when we are saying that renewables are the new baseload, then can the baseload design of the fuel supply agreements persist? Or do we need fuel markets where it will provide much more flexibility? So the second proposition which I have is that in this new environment, you cannot treat coal contracts like the way you have done. You have to open up the fuel supply chain and bring markets in if you have to really have the power markets and the power sector thrive itself. There are issues related to stressed assets. The reality is that we cannot have stressed assets, those asset stresses which are happening are not only bringing the power sector and the banking sector down, we are losing valuable assets, making them unworkable at this point of time. Because once the interest piles up, they go through liquidation processes, it is a lot of loss of value. But if you open those up and find ways to operate through the markets, maybe there's a life over there for the ones which are good assets. For the ones which do not need to survive, they don't need to survive. But we have everything in that basket which markets can provide a segue to handle those. Network utilization and system operations processes need to change. along with everything else. So how you price transmission, how you allow transmission access, how you play out open access needs to change. The system operator today, Mr. Sooni and I were discussing about SCED and the kind of huge impact it can have potentially if it really plays it out, the full potential of it plays it out. We have to make those things happen. And the good thing is that there is openness in the policymakers, in the regulators, in the system operators to look at all those measures. Finally, we have to look at utility sustainability, and utility sustainability doesn't come from only financial sustainability. If we put more subsidies into that, it's not going to sort the problem out. Sustainability is a much more, deeper process of building, financial strength, but also human resource capability, strengths, what Mr. Sooni had started as a process of educating the system operators, taking them through certification processes for participating in the right manner for operating in the system operation, doing the system operations as well as participating and facilitating markets. All of those things become very, very important. And again, I'm very happy that as a country with all our challenges, we have actually taken significant moves forward in all of this. Have we gone all the way where we need to go? I think we have come to a point where we have some very serious choices to make. And this is where we need to make, what are we playing for? If the goal is not clear, if the goalpost is not clear, then we are not going to get there. And here, what we are, see from archetype A to archetype D, this is just characterizations. Details can be as you wish to be. On the left-hand side is what we had earlier, command and control center, command and control operator structures, which used to be the way of working till we had markets. We currently are at thin markets, the spot markets being 3 to 4%, the ancillary services, everything together, even the trading market put together about 10%. That's actually thin markets. It does allow a lot of things, but it also doesn't allow a lot of things, because if you have to have reliability on a long-term basis through that market, then it doesn't work. Okay, but if you want to do short-term transactional aspects, you can do a great deal of things through that. Then we need to think about where do we want to go, more significant markets, and eventually what is characterized as full markets, where most of the trades happen through markets. I think what came out through this whole consultation process with the industry, with CEA, with CRC, is that we need to make that choice. Without that goal being defined, we are always going to fish around without a direction. So I think that's something which, at the high level, we need to achieve. But before we get there, or get to that end point, we have to make the selection and choice. But to get there, we need a lot of building blocks. Now, let me start with planning and forecasting. We think that when it comes to markets, everybody does their own thing. This is how all the commodity markets work. This can work in electricity markets. What the group has come out and repeatedly now come to the saying that with the complex sector that electricity is and the federal structure that we operate in, unless we have a better planning and forecasting process, and forecasting is long range and short range, planning is typically long range, but it can be interim planning. We need a lot more capability in the planning and forecasting area. Is enough being done? I think on a scale of 1 to 10, our planning process is somewhere on 2 at this point of time. Not the national level planning, which is okay, we have some, stipulations in the law of having a national electricity plan, and that gets prepared. But the way it gets prepared and the participation of the actual actors in that process is actually very, very weak in my assessment. And so we need to get that part right. It's an essential building block. We have to get the transmission parts right, not belaboring that. There's a lot has been talked about it, but if we have to get markets right, we have to get transmission right. We have to have enforcement of capacity adequacy. We have to have capacity statements. So if 5 years down the line, I expect the load to be something, I cannot as a DISCOM say that, sorry, I haven't planned for it, I'll see when it happens. That's not how markets can operate. It comes back to my first point about better planning and forecasting. It has to be accompanied by something which is enforceable by the regulator and system operator to say that this must happen, you must plan for adequate capacity, other than that you cannot operate in this market. This is something which happens in a country like Brazil, where you have this kind of a very rigorous process happening, and Brazil is going through what it is, we see it in the press, but we must recognize that they have built very strong institutions in the electricity sector across their 64 provinces, and ANEEL, the regulator, manages this processes with a iron hand and doesn't let that sector slip. in that, despite being a federal structure like we are, and despite all the challenges that you see, it works very, very well. We need fuel market reforms. I've talked about that. We need some procedural aspects like gate closure norms to be looked at. Again, we have far too much of leeway and flexibility at times. At least things are going to progress, but as of now, there have been enough debates about it, and maybe Mr. Narasimhan as the session chair can elaborate on that further. Institutional capacity I have talked about. Governance. We operate in a manner where we say that, we'll deal with it when it comes. We don't need to follow rules. The rules are there on paper. So we have a fantastic set of rules and regulations, but often, the utilities are not bound by them. They don't feel bound by them. I think that's something which has to change if we have to have order in the markets. And data disclosure. Absolutely essential, and we have actually improved quite a bit. If you look at data disclosure in the last 3-4 years, we have improved quite a bit. Have we got where we have to go for real efficient markets? I think we have to open up data much, much more without causing risks to the system, security risks to the system. So we need security aspects for that. We need to protect privacy. We need to recognize that there are commercial interests over there, but within that, a lot more can be done. So this is where, I'm conscious that I shouldn't use more time than we have to. This is something which I'm putting out to you as a set of things. There are more slides, but you can look at those. I'm sure the publishers will publish this. The organizers will publish this. But just looking at long-term, medium-term, and short-term, this is what came out. Long-term, as I mentioned, the long-term PPAs that we have really do not work. We need to have more flexible PPAs. And those flexibility in the PPAs will help improve the markets, the functioning of the markets, because they will become market interfacing instruments more and more. We need to plan, and we need to signal to capacity addition through capacity statements. Eventually, you can move to capacity markets. Not now. I don't think it's necessary in the next 1 year, 2 years, but we must plan for that architecture as we go along. Moving to retail competition, we should not forget, and we tend to forget, especially in India, that finally we exist for the customer. And those customers are now much more empowered than we ever were. They will exercise their choices. So better to co-opt them. And the market is a very good way of co-opting them. The markets can operate at a high level, but market signals can be sent to the customers in various ways, including through dynamic pricing, which has been talked about, not been done. In fact, if you look at our TOD designs, they are laughable in that sense. So we need to talk about that. Obligation to serve. This is a long-term cultural aspect. I think our ability to disconnect has been always dominating any thoughts about obligation to serve. So I think we need to get that over, and I think the government has been thinking about it, but bringing that as something which is enforceable. And if you don't do it, it's something which you can be hauled up for, is something which we need to do. In the medium term, short to medium term, we need to look at supply, increasing supply in the electricity markets. A 4% market, it doesn't work. So this is where, again, the regulator has been working, POSOCA has been working quite extensively. We need to look at how we get more and more of that participation. So the SCED, for example, is looking at all the residuals coming in through some kind of a market mechanism. It's not quite a market as of this point of time, but we can get to markets around that. Load dispatch centers need the human capacity as well as the tools to do forecasting, scheduling, dispatch, redispatch through the every 15-minute thing. Now, this is something not impossible to attain, because now we have been working with multiple states under this program, particularly with Telangana, where now this happens on a routine basis. And every day, every 15 minutes, they redispatch their portfolio to get to optimality on a regular basis. What we are also doing under the program is they're now trying to put all of this under an open platform, which can be accessed by all the utilities to perform the same operation. So this is something which you should be seeing in the next 1 year. We have to ensure compliance with declared capacity. This changing declared capacity, gate closure norms, once you close, you close. I think that's something. After that, the market should be the instrument for people to readjust their positions. If we are looking at readjusting their positions to the changing of the schedules, and the schedules don't have sanctity. I know it's a little controversial. The states have their opinions on it, but there is a way which they have to accept on that. Compliant contract reneging is something which needs to be avoided, and that's where the trust in markets or any market platform comes in. And a range of issues. I talked about fuel market reforms. We need to have contract for differences. CRC has been talking about the MBED, which has been, hopefully going to be tried out. It will have its challenges. None of these will be easy. And we know that when KPMG was operating the CFD market in the UK, challenges came from quarters which we didn't even think, and that was a simpler mechanism than what we're trying over here. But that shouldn't stop us from trying. I think this is something which is very, very important to remember. And in terms of real-time intraday markets, again, Gitkoja I've spoken about going to auction-based intraday mechanisms. I think that's something on the radar, on the cards. So one must recognize I'm talking about a process which ran for 2 years, 3 years. In the meantime, many of these things have been progressed, and that's a good thing because it's been just not on paper, but we are seeing simultaneously progressing. How do we price in the markets, whether we have a single auction price and then, or we have multiple auctions, what is the process? I think there's some amount of work to be done. There's clearly the need for intraday products. And this is something which is going to help the RE process, because without the intraday products becoming vibrant, there's going to be a challenge over there. Now, again, CRC is talking of making significant changes to the design of the intraday markets, which hadn't taken off. I think that's something which is going to be important. Transitioning from an ancillary services mechanism to an ancillary services market should be the next step. Again, work happening on that. But the point is that we need to remain engaged. There will be challenges. Without a question, there will be challenges. We will be needing to remain engaged. Market power mitigation. Now, market power happens in odd ways, and when you operate with markets, this is a fear which we have. And some of the markets are illiquid markets. You can have market power in those illiquid markets very easily. What we need to do is maintain surveillance and make sure that we are getting online data which has a routine set of tests which are automatically run through robotic processes to make sure that the regulator has, or the system operator has an alert the moment anything is suspected. Now, this is something, again, we have worked with the CERC, and that should be up and running in the next 1 month. It's more or less ready. The chairman is taking a final look at it, where, at different levels of operation, at the chairman's level, at the, various technical levels, as well as, at the market monitoring cell level, they are going to get a continuous feed of how the markets are performing. And finally, we have talked about real-time markets, which is RTM is all in the works. I'll just end with emphasizing both those points again, that all of this requires trust. Markets operate on trust. And for trust, we need transparency, we need data. Okay. And that should be as freely available as possible, including the market surveillance things which we are talking about with CRC. Our advice has been some of these are just not going into exchange data. They're taking public data, but processing public data. To the extent we believe that it's better to just make it public, we should just make it public. There's no harm in this. It's something through robotic processes. We are taking from all the exchanges, through the transmission lines, public data which is available and being done. And most importantly, we now need to work at the institution capacity creation. I'll just end with saying that while we talk about all these things in Delhi and at the national level, the action happens at the states. It is time possibly to take these discussions where great progress has been made and move the theater to the states where actual change can happen. They do learn. It's not that they don't learn. They do learn if you give the opportunity, but we need to focus on that. I'm going to end over here, cognizant of the time. Thank you so much again for the opportunity.